podcast. I am your host for today, J.C. Harris, and this is an emergency episode, which we were supposed to do them vertical and short form, but I got places to be and could not even get to the studio. We wanted to put out something because we've got literally dozens of emails from people concerned about their port packages, and we've heard about legislation, and you've been holding off. Thank you. To be honest, we struck out this year. We're going to have sort of an explainer on the process, but if you have been waiting patiently to hear some good news regarding sound insulation, we have none to provide. We'd like to be able to say, hang in there, because there are always a few other avenues we're going down, but we have nothing date certain, and it's unfair to keep asking people to wait and wait. We know there are many of you who really need to do something now, and we're sorry. We really try. Now, for the next layer of people who hear that there is legislation in Olympia, we went 0 for 4. We keep pushing HB 1303, which involves improving the permitting process for large environmental things like the SAMP, and that did not even get to a hearing. People can't seem to make the connection between permitting and airports, even though that is exactly what the SAMP is about. It's a permitting process. There is also a tremendous emphasis both at the federal and state level on permitting reform. The vibe is to speed things up, and the notion of more review, meaning the environmental concerns of Sea-Tac Airport, has gotten a bad reputation. Many people of my generation kind of did it to ourselves. We used permitting projects, including the third runway, as a tool to stop things rather than make them better. And what is happening now is the inevitable backlash. We're going to try and sound as grateful as possible. Basically, Senator Orwell put forward 2 bills, and the moment she did that, essentially everyone went over there, and both of those bills are dead as well. SB 5652, we were frankly skeptical of last year's bill, and this one did not thrill us either, because it basically was an omnibus kind of approach to try to address every airport impact. It is swinging for the seats, and we are all about 3 yards and a cloud of dust. Go Michigan Wolverines. But it's just so appealing, the notion of doing something really big. It distracts people from doing the boring thing. This will sound, I guess, bitter, but that's really what happens. You try to bite off far more than you can chew. The other bill, which was connected to 5652, they really could not be separated, also died. One of the big objections to 5652 was that there was no money. So you can have all these aspirational things for airport communities, but if there's no money, so what? SB 6240 was the money end of it, and it was extremely appealing because it would use a very tiny slice of aviation fuel tax, and that sounds completely intuitive to people. We pay like road taxes, we pay a little fuel tax for our cars. The rest of this is sort of a cautionary tale on that. I gave testimony at the public hearing on 6240 as something of a Hail Mary, because if you go to our About page, one of our main goals is to provide ongoing revenue sources for airport impacts. Again, we were skeptical, but we wanted to show support in principle. But we keep meaning to do an episode on something called revenue diversion and call this a draft. So I'm in Olympia at that Ways and Means Committee, which controls spending. So they hear every bill of importance outside of transportation. They have to deal with like 500 bills in 60 days. So you might think, well, an aviation fuel tax, that's pretty arcane, but of course, there are actually 3 aviation fuel tax bills under consideration. Why wouldn't there be? And before every bill is presented, or if there's a group of related bills, there will be an explainer by a subject matter expert. And in this case, it was Ann Rickert, the WashDOT Director of Aviation. And she gave a great overview of these 3 fuel tax bills. They are super complicated, but after hearing what she said, I was like, ruh-roh. Airports are like a giant enterprise fund. Think the US Post Office. It's a business run by a government. That's Sea-Tac Airport. It's owned by a government agency, the Port of Seattle, but it's run like a business. Large or tiny, they've got rental cars and restaurants, they promote tourism. Some places teach people how to fly, how to skydive. It's all very cool. And it became obvious early on to Congress that people would, get creative with using the various funds that, happen around the airport. For example, teaching people how to skydive or build helicopters on airport property. They're airporty, right? They involve things, up in the sky, people coming down in a parachute. But that's not what Congress wanted. Congress has said explicitly, you can read it in the code, take every drop of money from every aspect of airport operations and use it to improve the airport. Get it? It's a business. Plow everything back into the business. You can resurface runways, you can upgrade terminals. You could also use it to fund a water treatment plant because that's something a business does. That's a direct cost. But what you can't use those kinds of taxes for indirect stuff. In short, what happens at the airport stays at the airport, just like Vegas. See what I did there? I worked in the casino metaphor. I think that was pretty good of me. We haven't done it in a while, but we did a quick scan and we found at least 70 FAA lawsuits where airports were trying to say, we want to take a portion of sales tax, fuel tax, whatever, and use it for some airport adjacent idea. And every time, sooner or later, the FAA says, we'd rather you didn't. So this is going to get even more complicated. So, sorry. Now here's where 6240 came in. 6240 was not a new tax, not at all. For over a decade, the state of Washington and the FAA have been in a sort of low-grade food fight over something called offsets. The FAA would prefer that every bit of that luscious airport revenue, taxes, whatever, be stored in one account. It's called the aeronautic account. Technically, the FAA allows states and airports to develop a customized plan, and you can submit a plan to, let's say, take a portion of that fuel tax money and put it in other government accounts in order to fund projects that are about airport improvement. Again, these are called offsets. So, for example, the state has taken aviation fuel tax money for some road projects that are directly linked to our airports. You can clearly see the through line. Now, the FAA approves your plan, which they've done with the state, but it's sort of a trial basis. You need to understand that everything to do with the FAA sooner or later gets reviewed, and they can either accept or reject these cases. So the state has been trying out these things, but the FAA has been coy in providing a final approval. And in fact, they're going through a tussle right now about it, as late as October of 2024. The state has set up not one, but many such offsets. One thing that Director Rickard says in her speech to the committee is that some of them are not okay, and some of them are on the fence. One of the concerns expressed in the FAA's documentation concerns an account used by the Department of Ecology called Model Toxics Control Account. Takes a little bit of sales from fuel uplift, which means coming up out of the ground, which is different from fuel being transported. Anyway, even that has several layers of code. Anyway, ultimately, the idea is to allocate a tiny slice of fuel taxes to environmental remediation, so long as it's related to airport operations. That's also an offset, and we can also see that as being, kind of in the ballpark. However, what 6240 proposed was to take a slice of that and create a new account. So take some money from that Model Toxics Control account, actually sort of a growth factor, and shift it over to a new place called an Aviation Impacted Communities account, right? It's saying that aviation community impacts would be another expanded legal use of that funding for all kinds of air quality studies and remediation and HEPA filters and sound insulation for the entire state area that is supposedly covered by the port, which is 92 square miles from Beacon Hill and Georgetown down to Federal Way. It's just massive. And that right there just was like, wow. Here's, even another little tangent. The port districts can and have used ecology money for environmental cleanup totally legit on airport properties that have now been moved over to cities such as Laurel Lake in Burien. It's an interesting discussion because that money is being used for legitimate environmental cleanup. But the FAA would prefer that you get approval of your plan before implementation. What 6240 was, we'll do it first, we'll expand to a new use case, and then if the FAA complains, we'll cross that bridge when we come to it. And that did not thrill us. 6240 struck us more like the skydiving deal. It's definitely airporty, but it's not airport. It's not in any of the use cases approved by Congress. It was a proposal to test how far one might expand that funding for broader cumulative environmental health impacts, not even cleanup of an existing site or sound insulation, but studies, committees, community grants, HEPA filters, prevention, compensation. And this is where politics get involved. We all talk about NEPA and the Environmental Protection Agency, but there is this other controlling agency at the federal level called the Council on Environmental Quality, which is an office of the president. people beat up on me, but essentially the core of all environmental policy rests with the president. People focus on NEPA and SEPA and everything, but that CEQ, it drives overall environmental policy. It sets the tone for every federal agency. Regardless of your politics, does the current federal administration seem amenable to even more expansive uses of aviation fuel taxes? You get it? Is it more likely in this environment for the FAA to sign off on a novel use case? Now, there's already a framework in place for evaluating aviation-specific noise. We have 24 noise monitors around the airport. They have a mechanism for noise in code. So we could have seen a much tighter bill, like a paragraph, that simply talked about aviation fuel tax for port packages. We knew the right bill from day one. And at the tail end, there was some talk about dialing back to that. But yeah, good luck. So we're going to get even scoldier here. We have not done the work necessary to anywhere get close to quantifying aviation pollution like we do with noise. The pollution is totally real, and if anything, every new report shows it's worse than we think. But it hasn't been turned into numbers the way DNL and SEL have been. That's why we've been so enthusiastic about setting up an air quality monitor in Des Moines to create those standards. So from that point of view, the FAA is not being a grouch. From their point of view, they're being proper stewards of public money. There has to be a protocol, a methodology in place. They don't want to pay for a process to develop that methodology. Maybe they should, but they haven't. In using any aviation tax for things beyond what they have already signed off on, it's just, yeah. If you feel like, how dare the FAA interfere with local control, they're not. They can't make you do anything. They simply give you a choice. If you don't do it, fine. They pull your grant funding. And that is why airports like the Port of Seattle will never support this kind of stuff. Every airport is basically out of business if they lose FAA grant money. With all the nerve, that was the express will of Congress. We did support 6240 despite all of these pitfalls, because at bottom, its heart was in the right place. 6240 was the first attempt in a long time to get out of the mindset of one-time grants. But it did not pass because it could not pass. And people need to hear this. It wasn't the evil port or the FAA or any kind of politics or something like that. It was the wrong language. Now, you can go to any number of airports, and I'll throw out Connecticut because we've experienced with their situation, and they had a speaker, Dr. Huda, who's one of the top people regarding ultrafine particles. They did get a fuel tax towards sound insulation, and they also approved money for HEPA filters for everybody near one airport. But here's the interesting thing. The money for the HEPA filters is not coming from that fuel tax. It's coming from their state's general fund. We haven't found any airport that has tried to do what 6240 was attempting. Meanwhile, those other two aviation fuel tax bills, because remember, there were three presented that day, there was no evil involved. What they were trying to do is something completely defensible. Stop doing any of those offsets. All fuel tax should just stay in the aeronautics account and be used for airports. If airport communities want funding for mitigation, great. Just get it from the general fund. Get people to vote for it. And what's been pointed out to us more than once, again, there is this multi-billion-dollar climate commitment fund, right? Right? A very worthy and noble purpose. It charges a fee to polluters, allocates money for grants to reduce the impact of climate change, environmental stuff. Love it. But like the fuel tax, it's turned out to be a really juicy amount of money. So what's starting to happen, even this session, that irresistible urge to get creative. For example, I saw a bill at the state that talked about using CCA money for road improvements. I mean, somebody said with a straight face that, well, if the roads are less bumpy, it leads to higher mileage and greater fuel efficiency and lower pollution. See, that's the skydiving school of creativity, my friend. It's what the FAA fears, revenue diversion. The reason the FAA is so snippy about any kind of diversion, from fuel taxes to landing fees to skydiving, whatever, is because Congress did not vote for it. And if you allow even the slightest hint of it, no matter how worthy at one airport, you open the floodgates at airports everywhere. You can love the FAA, you can hate the FAA, but their message has generally been, if you want to do that kind of thing, get somebody to put it in a reauthorization bill. And that brings us to what you really should be asking every legislator. Not why aren't you more supportive of bills like 6240, but why is it so dang hard to get a couple of $1 million a year from the state of Washington just out of the general fund or the CCA or the Port of Seattle? With all the money that the port brings in, with all the benefits the airport generates, I mean, everyone just falls all over themselves to talk about how great it is. Why is that never on the table? You could take money from anywhere. With all a bazillion dollars of benefit, why do we have to bury this kind of thing so far down into the weeds and do something so risky to avoid taking something from somebody else? Why is our need any less worthy? Because at the end of the day, budgets are about winners and losers. You could certainly find a way amongst $77 billion, that's the state budget for 2 years, a couple of $1 million a year just under the couch. A rounding error. Why can't you get votes to support even that? This is no indictment of Senator Orwell. She's doing God's work and sometimes pushing against her own constituents. The fact is, the city of Des Moines, among other actors in this equation, has had no sound insulation code for 13 years. If your own city values sound insulation at 0, why should anyone at the state, at the federal level, hell, at King County, why should anyone give us a dime? My tone is because we have a sense of urgency. As I said at the top, we know the dozens of people who are waiting now, who need help. This legislation betrayed a lack of urgency and seriousness. Because even if by some miracle both bills had passed, recall what the WashDOT director said, we're still not done going back and forth with the FAA over current offsets. There's every reason to believe that anything new would again be tested. And 5652 would put off practical relief at least until 2028. We owed it to people to deliver something practical this year. That should have been the goal. There's been a working program in California for port package updates. They know how to do it, and there are funding mechanisms in other states that conform to the FAA's requirements. So we've got both pieces in place to get something done this year. And we consider this a group failure. We keep trying for years to say, here's what's possible, here's what's practical. Instead, we got poorly researched legislation. This is politics. These kinds of bills, we call it a siren song because they're so irresistible. People want to believe. But we owe it to the public to do better, to deliver every year. And we'll keep doing what we can to get people to wake up.